You're watching Global Insight, where we speak to experts from around the world on issues making headlines. I'm Ulsi Young. The Global Climate Conference of world leaders held in Egypt in November seems significantly more muted than previous COP summits, which set out ambitious targets to protect our planet. There was a focus on the promise of innovation and clean technologies, as well as the centrality of water and agriculture to the climate crisis. And as the year wraps up, we discuss what course of action all countries need to take in order to quickly transition from a carbon-heavy way of life to sustainability in all aspects. And for this, we connect with Rick Steiner, Professor and Director of Oasis Earth, and Esther Choi, PhD and Associate of World Resources Institute. Very warm welcome to you both, and it's lovely to see you again, Dr. Steiner. And well, my first question goes to you actually, and was hoping to hear your opinion on this for about over a month now. And while the recent COP27 summit, there wasn't much buzz around it as usual, compared to previous years when we had this landmark climate conference, and it was rather underwhelming for many observers as well. So, in what ways do you think this summit succeeded and also failed, I suppose?
Yeah, your observations are absolutely correct. I guess the limited success there was that there was at least a tentative agreement to establish a loss and damage fund by which rich nations would help fund adaptation measures for the developing world. But you know, we've been here before. The Green Climate Fund was agreed 12 years ago, which was to be $100 billion a year financial mechanism by which the rich countries would help fund adaptation measures for developing countries, and virtually none of that has been funded, maybe 10 or 11 billion dollars. So it'll be interesting to see whether the Loss and Damage Fund actually gets funded. But the big issue at COP27 was they avoided the most important task, and that's to agree on sufficient, far more aggressive emissions reductions. We are no longer going to be able to meet 1.5 degrees C over pre-industrial levels, and we're still headed, given our existing commitments, to 2.5 to 3 degrees Celsius over baseline. And that is an apocalyptic future. There was no agreement or discussion of a global carbon tax. There was no agreement on eliminating perverse fossil fuel subsidies. There was no money for the Green Climate Fund. And there's essentially no agreement to fully fund the transition that we need to do. So it's my conclusion that the UN process will simply not solve this. And this is a problem that was created and needs to be solved by the G20, the 20 industrialized nations of the world, with $4 trillion annually, $2 trillion for the developing world, $2 trillion domestically over the next 10 years. That's the sufficient kind of investment that the G20 needs to make in order to make this transition. Over the next 10 years, it's an investment to save the future of human civilization. Pretty good investment.
Right, so we haven't seen this kind of determined, very practical course of action being planned or agreed upon by world leaders. And Dr. Choi, what was your takeaway from COP27? Do you think it made any kind of progress from the last two summits in Paris and Glasgow?
Sure. I would say I would portray the COP process quite a bit differently and provide more optimistic viewpoint regarding the process, because I think the establishment of a fund dedicated to loss and damage was a historical breakthrough. And loss and damage is a general term used in UN climate negotiations to refer to the impacts of climate change that go beyond what people can adapt to. Examples include the loss of coastal historical site due to sea level rise, or the loss of homes and lives because of extreme floods. But loss and damage inevitably affects vulnerable communities the most, making it a climate justice issue as well. And as Dr. Steiner pointed out, discussions around loss and damage have been controversial historically, but at COP27 this year, countries finally agreed to establish funding arrangements to address loss and damage, including a dedicated fund. And while we don't have details yet, this is definitely a first positive step towards setting aside resources for vulnerable countries. And another element is that there is a growing recognition that the $100 billion target established by the Paris Agreement back in 2015 is nowhere close to what is needed, which is in trillions of dollars to avoid the most catastrophic effects of climate change. So the so-called the climate investment gap it continues to widen, and the international community is looking to diversify the funding sources to close the gap.
I see. And Dr. Steiner, well, after this conference, well, some leaders showed their disappointment at the lack of progress on some of the fronts that you mentioned. And for some countries, rising sea levels, it's really considered an existential threat. It's not just an inconvenience. And the Association of Small Island States, they expressed their concern that there weren't any bolder moves towards the Paris goals. And well, we saw over the stretch of the pandemic that, our use of plastics, very unsustainable ways of life, they've been resuming and perhaps even worsening. A recent report estimated that 129 billion face masks and 65 billion gloves have been used just each month during the pandemic. And well, how threatening are they to our oceans? And do you think plastics usage has worsened during COVID?
Absolutely, no question. A lot of the single-use plastic bans were suspended during COVID out of an abundance of caution regarding viral transmission and things like that. Some well thought through, many not. So plastic use soared during the pandemic, and that's unfortunate. And we produce over 400 million tons of plastic annually. Human economies do. 11 to 15 million tons of that winds up every year in the oceans, and that's accumulating in the oceans. And a lot of these masks and plastic gloves and bottle caps and everything else comes out of rivers, mainly out of 10 rivers from East Asia into the global ocean, primarily out of China. And we know this has been a problem for the last 50 years. This stuff is accumulating. It's damaging marine ecosystems, marine wildlife. It takes a long time to degrade. We know what to do about it. We need better solid waste management procedures on shore, because almost all of this comes from shore-based sources. Fortunately, the UN is negotiating a really quick trip on a plastic treaty, which they hope to have secured and agreed by 2024, which is a really short timeline for a UN convention or treaty. Generally, they take 5 to 10 years. But this UNEP, United Nations Environment Program treaty, they just had an intergovernmental negotiating committee meeting a few weeks ago. They're moving forward rapidly, and the goal of this is to reduce the production of plastics, certainly increase the recycling of plastics and the better management of them, and reduce the ocean input, and to go to more of a circular economy, which we know we have to do. So we know how to solve this. We just need to put the money and the political will into it to do it.
I see. And Dr. Steiner, well, what will changes in biodiversity really affect the functioning of the ocean's ecosystems?
If that's to me, the ocean ecosystems are in crisis without question. They're suffering from overexploitation, a century or more of overexploitation, both fisheries and whaling and such like that. Chronic pollution, as well as climate change now. We have a catastrophic collapse in seabird populations, many marine mammal populations, large fish throughout the ocean ecosystems, ocean acidification and warming. And so we need to drastically reduce human impacts in ocean systems over the next 30 to 40 years to give ocean ecosystems the best chance possible to sustain and to recover throughout this century of climate crisis. We know how to do that. We need to cut fish catch in half. We need to reduce certain other impacts in the oceans, and particularly we need to reduce carbon emissions to reduce acidification and warming in the oceans as well. So,
I see. And Dr. Choi, well, there's We had our nations pledge to help developing countries really catch up with their climate goals and move ahead, make things more sustainable. But then there's this huge growing funding gap when it comes to financing these kind of climate goals. So what course of action do you think is really needed at this point?
Sure. I think we need to really ramp up mobilizing all sorts of capital, and we cannot just rely on government budgets or public expenditures because they're constrained. So that's one of the reasons why blended finance, which is a strategic use of public or philanthropic capital to catalyze private investments that would otherwise not be available for climate investments in developing countries, is gaining traction as part of the solution. And climate finance flows are heavily skewed towards mitigation, which is reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. And only 10% of the total climate finance flows is dedicated to climate adaptation and building resilience, especially in developing countries against the impacts of climate change. So we really need to ramp up our efforts to mobilize the scale of climate finance and have a balanced approach towards mitigation and adaptation so that developing countries can adapt to the impacts of climate change and become more resilient to the impacts of climate change.
I see. And well, Dr. Steiner, how do you hope to see world leaders really approach marine science and policy going forward?
Well, they need to certainly be far more bold. There's this culture within governments and sometimes industry as well to be cautious and tepid and incremental in responses to crises. This is a crisis we cannot afford incrementalism on any longer. This decade, 2020 to 2030, is the critical defining decade of human evolution. Either we get this right, not just for climate, but also consumption, production, biodiversity, population, pollution and such, all these stressors on the global biosphere, either we break through or we break down. And so world leaders need to be far more bold and aggressive. And that's why, echoing what Dr. Choi said, we need aggressive financing. We need at least $4 trillion annually spent on these issues globally. And this has to come from the G20 to the rest of the world and to G20 nations themselves, considered an investment in a sustainable future. You know, in the United States, we spent $8 trillion in 2 years on our COVID response. Clearly, climate change and pollution and overexploitation and resource consumption collectively are far more critical issue than COVID long term. And so we need to make the investment, make this, you know, we need to be bold. And particularly, there's a treaty being negotiated right now at the UN called the Area Beyond Biodiversity and Areas Beyond National Jurisdiction, the High Seas Ocean Treaty. That needs to be agreed to. And there needs to be at least 50% of the global ocean, both in the high seas and within the EEZs, the exclusive economic zones of coastal nations, set aside as strongly protected marine reserves within the next 7 years by 2030. If we can get there, then the oceans have a really good chance of surviving this debacle that we've brought upon them this century.
Hopefully leaders will take bolder, more ambitious steps towards these goals. And Dr. Choi, before we go, now what have you been doing at the World Resources Institute in efforts towards these climate goals for the world?
Sure. The World Resources Institute, or WRI, is a global research organization of about 1,700 staff members around the world. So we conduct research in various formats, not only for climate, but other climate-related sectors such as forestry, agriculture, ocean, and energy. And we provide recommendations and solutions for practitioners in these sectors, as well as cross-sectoral themes such as finance, business, equity, and economics. We build and manage databases to inform decision makers and support researchers, such as GHG protocol. And we convene different stakeholders on various issues to build partnerships across the public and private sectors.
I see, and of course, Dr. Steiner has also authored a book, which he has provided for free on his website on Oasis Earth, to really raise awareness of the very pressing issues that we face as the world in order to preserve our oceans and really actively tackle climate change. And well, this is where we'll have to wrap up this interview today. That was Rick Steiner, Professor and Director of Oasis Earth, and Esther Choi, PhD and Associate of World Resources Institute. Thank you both so much for your time today.
Thank you, Soo-Young.
Thank you for having me.
Also, thank you very much to our viewers for tuning in. It's the weekend now, so have a lovely time, have a lovely weekend wherever you are in the world. Goodbye.